In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. If you go for a drive on a moorland road at this time of year, in the North Pennines, or the Lakeland Fells, or the North York Moors, or the Yorkshire Dales, or I guess the Shropshire Hills and the Welsh Marches and the Quantocks and the Mendips and a lot of the rest of the West Country, you're very likely at some point along that road to come quite quickly to a homemade sign with words and quite possibly some pictures as well to catch the eye. The sign will say, "Beware of the sheep." Now, it could be that upland farmers across England have been watching too many Alfred Hitchcock films, and they are wanting to warn you of flocks of sheep swarming down upon you to come and impose themselves in terrifying ways. But I guess most of us, most of the time, understand the warning, "Beware of the sheep," as a warning to look out for them in case we should do them harm, especially, of course, newborn lambs. That's usually what the picture is, if there is one, straggling their way across the road because no one has yet taught them the sheep Green Cross code. On the days when the church fills its liturgy with references to sheep and shepherds, and that happens this Sunday and Christ the King Sunday and on one or two other Sundays in the year, and if you've ever been a habitual prayer book matins worshipper, it happens every Sunday, there is a good case for saying sometimes, beware of the sheep. Sheep and shepherds become such an omnipresent part of Anglican talk and thinking and liturgy that we stop noticing what's distinctive and we start taking too many things for granted. We imagine that we are all meant to be sheep, which isn't quite what the stories are saying. And if we all imagine that we're meant to be sheep, we then imply all sorts of things into it that usually sheep farmers will tell us are totally wide of the mark. I think I've survived so far in ministry without a farmer coming up afterwards and saying to me, "You don't know anything much about sheep, do you?" Which of course is true, I don't. But we can import ideas and it sends us off at a great tangent. We have to beware of the sheep because we imagine that somewhere in the parable we're being asked to be the sheep to Jesus the Good Shepherd. And again, if I may borrow my experience from the north, though I noticed that neither of the two churches of this parish possesses one of the most common stained glass windows in most of the churches in which I have served has been the image of Jesus the Good Shepherd. There he is standing with a lamb in his arms, probably a few more round his feet. And I know that it's an image that appeals deeply to some people. In my last church, a window that had been for many years in that corner, when that corner got filled with some organ pipes, it was re-established with lighting behind it in an arch that didn't have a window space at this end, so that people could see it more easily again. Beware of the sheep, because they impose upon us expectations of who we should be, when our calling is to be much more than an anonymous flock. No, I can hear a farmer saying, "What makes you think that sheep all do the same thing at the same time?" Beware of the sheep. But also, beware of what we then drag in on top of the sheep. Because how many preachers, when talking about sheep, then tell you what shepherds are supposed to do? How many sermons have you heard where someone says, "English shepherds do this, but back in Jesus' time, Palestinian shepherds did that"? It's all on a bit shaky evidence, really, and it's a bit general in both directions. And when talking about shepherds, beware of the add-ons. These things. How many bishops' sermons at confirmations have you heard explaining a shepherd's crook? I've heard several from several bishops, so I have to say none of my recent ones. Shepherd's crooks, although they are very useful, and this obviously is a minor example, they are also quite tricky things. Move them at the wrong time or leave them lying around and they can be a trip hazard. Wave them in inappropriate ways and they can harm someone quite quickly. Carry them and you're suggesting something that may be not exactly what you are. I'm not a bishop, and I'm certainly not an expert livestock manager. And yet how often when we talk about shepherds do we allow ourselves to drift onto the accoutrements, or the smelliness, or the living conditions, rather than where Jesus and where the witness of the scriptures want to take us? Where do they want to take us? Shepherd is one of the prime images of God in the witness of the prophets. God is the faithful shepherd. And by extension, he calls whoever is leading his people to be an imitator of that faithfulness. So what's lying underneath Peter's confrontation with the Sanhedrin in our first reading this morning is exactly the charge that they have failed to exercise that faithfulness. Luke's history is a bit shaky because he names Annas as high priest when it was almost certainly Caiaphas. But he gives us that clear picture of there being a high priestly caste and a family who have their finger into every pie and a sort of cabal around which all decisions are made. Politics doesn't change that much, does it? Into that, Peter says, you have not seen God's action and God's faithfulness, and you, the leaders of the people, crucified the Lord of glory. That's not his phrase in this reading, but it's one of the ones he uses. God presents himself as faithful shepherd of his people so that they know in times of difficulty as well as times of plenty that there is someone looking out for them, looking over them, watching them. Now, we import lots of shepherd language into all sorts of aspects of our lives. Whenever we talk about things being pastoral, we are talking about shepherds. When we refer to the great Pope who sent a mission to England called Gregory, we are talking about someone whose name means a watcher over the flock. He happens to have written a great manual on pastoral care, as it happens. Shepherds are all over our language. And when priests are ordained, we are told to hold the pattern of the Good Shepherd before us, which is, I have to say, one of the most daunting phrases in the whole ordinal, because none of us can quite be like Jesus, can we? And yet all of us are called to be as like Jesus as we can be. It's not just a job for this lot. Talking about shepherds runs the danger, beware of the shepherds, that we put people on pedestals that they need not to be on, just as much as the danger that the people who are on those pedestals then abuse them. But, on Good Shepherd Sunday, we are asked to think about what good shepherding means in the person of Jesus. The one who lays down his life for the sheep. The one who has a flock that is much wider than the gathered club think it is. The one whose mission is to bring together and to reconcile and of course to be the way, the truth, and the life. This Jesus, the Good Shepherd, is being contrasted with a hired hand who knows the point at which action is more than his job is worth and runs not so much for the hills as away from the hills. This Jesus is none of those. He genuinely puts the interests of those committed to him to his care. Now, in recent years, the church has wondered a bit about the use of the shepherd image for its ministers, lay and ordained, because of that burden that is placed upon them of expectation. There's a book written referring to George Herbert, who was also fond of the image of the pastor as someone who looked for his flock. There's a book written in recent years called "If You Meet George Herbert on the Road, Shoot Him," because there have been, over many generations, clerical casualties of those for whom the burdens have become too much. But it's not because Christ is our Good Shepherd. It's because we have corporately dumped upon the individual at the front a load of expectation that they will fulfill perhaps even our fantasies of what the Good Shepherd should look like. We are all called to be both shepherd and sheep. Do you remember that old spoof of the 23rd Psalm that begins, "The Lord and I are in a shepherd-sheep relationship"? We are called to be both parts of that relationship. So today, when we are thinking about the Good Shepherd, yes, we do need to beware of the sheep and beware of the expectations of the people that we make to be shepherds. We need to beware of things that we assume and things that we allow ourselves to believe that put us out of our own Christian calling to be faithful witnesses to Christ. But having taken wariness of the sheep, I'll write the sentence right eventually, having taken that wariness, we're still called to enjoy the landscape, to marvel at the wonder of the created order, and to raise a wry smile from time to time at the foibles and the eccentricities of that most wonderful animal. And oh yes, not to be too woolly in what we do and say. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.